The med bay hummed softly, sterile lights reflecting off cold white surfaces. The faint, steady pulse of machinery was the only sound, a far cry from the alarms and chaos that had ripped through the station earlier. Now the silence returned, but it held weight, heavy and dense, as if carrying something none of them wanted to acknowledge. The medic moved between the crew, her scanner in hand, its soft beeping the only break in the stillness. She worked with her usual precision, scanning one crew member, then the next. Her expression was calm, composed, though there was a tightness to her movements, a caution that hadn't been there before. The engineer sat at the edge of the examination table, helmet discarded on the floor, the last traces of moisture still clinging to its visor. His shoulders were slumped, the weight of fatigue dragging him down. He stared at nothing in particular as the medic passed the scanner over his chest. The faint beeps were distant, barely registering in his mind. His fingers twitched, restless without the familiar tools in hand, but there was no work to do now. Across the room, the security officer stood near the door, arms crossed, eyes sharp. She didn't wear her helmet. There was no need for full suits with the oxygen stabilized, but she stood with the same tension, as if bracing for the next command. She hadn't said much since they'd entered the med bay. She rarely spoke outside of orders, but today her silence seemed to carve a deeper space between her and the rest of the crew, a distance that made the room feel even smaller. The scanner beeped softly again as the medic moved to the biologist who sat stiffly on a stool, tablet untouched in her lap. Her fingers hovered above the screen, not scrolling as they usually did. She drew in shallow breaths as if each one took more effort than the last. The numbers and data she relied on for clarity now felt distant, failing to offer the refuge they once had. The medic watched the scanner's readings for a moment longer than necessary before moving on, saying nothing. They didn't need words. They all knew what had happened. The technician's absence was a presence all its own. The air in the medbay felt different despite the stabilized atmosphere. The faint hum of the station, once a comforting backdrop, now seemed unnervingly loud. Every slight vibration in the floor felt exaggerated. The space felt smaller, the sterile air thinner, the weight of the technician's death pressing down on them all. The medic finished her scans and stepped toward the console. The data flashed across the screen. No abnormalities. Aside from the understandable emotional trauma, everything was as it should be. Her fingers hovered above the controls, unmoving. She didn't look at the others, but she could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her to confirm what they already knew, that they were physically fine, that everything was normal. The engineer finally broke the silence, his voice rough and worn. "We done here?" The medic didn't look up. "Vitals are stable," she replied stiffly. The word hung in the air for a moment. Stable. No one responded, but the engineer nodded faintly, though the tension in his jaw didn't ease. The security officer shifted, her voice cutting through the stillness. "There's work to be done." It wasn't an order, but it didn't need to be. They all understood. The station wouldn't pause. Systems had to be maintained. The mission continued. She turned toward the door, her posture rigid, and the biologist stood soon after, clutching her tablet like it was the only thing tethering her to the moment. The engineer sat for a beat longer, his eyes drifting toward the floor where the technician had stood just hours before. Slowly he rose, his fingers brushing the edge of the table, as though grounding himself for what came next. The medic lingered at the console, staring at the readouts one last time before switching off the screen. She gathered her tools and followed the others out of the med bay. The silence followed them, thick and unresolved, as the weight of the technician's absence echoed in the empty room. The commander stood in the surveillance room, his arms crossed tightly against his chest, eyes scanning the monitors. He had been watching them since they regrouped, a silent observer. The engineer was in storage bay 3, bent over a set of tools, his movements methodical but stiff, like the routine was all that kept him grounded. The biologist lingered in her lab, fingers lightly tracing her data tablet, her expression carefully blank, though her eyes flicked a little too often towards the doorway. The commander could feel the tension swirling. It wasn't just the usual strain of life aboard the station. This was different, heavier, more insidious. The death of a crewmate had shaken something loose, something none of them could name, but all of them felt. He shifted his weight, feeling the pressure of the station closing in on him. Doubt had crept into his mind in a way that felt foreign, in the back of his thoughts like a low hum. Was he leading them right? Was he keeping them safe? The company had chosen him for this role because they trusted him to maintain control, to ensure the mission ran smoothly. But watching them now, seeing how their movements seemed slower, how their gazes drifted, it was hard to ignore the cracks forming. The commander's eyes lingered once more on the engineer who worked in silence. There was something off in his posture, a slight tremor in his hands, even as he worked with the precision expected of him. He was focused, but a little too focused, as though the task was the only thing holding him together. The commander thought about stepping in, saying something over the tannoy to ease the tension. But what could he say? Words wouldn't undo what had happened. And then there was the biologist. She hadn't spoken since they left the oxygen room, and her attention seemed fixed on her tablet. Her hands moved across the screen, collecting data, but her focus was fraying. Her fingers occasionally stilled, hovering just above the display before moving again. The commander knew she was avoiding something. Maybe they all were. The technician's death had left a mark, and the silence that had followed wasn't a natural one. It had weight, a kind of absence that filled the space between them. And now the commander felt the weight of leadership more keenly than ever. The commander glanced toward the door, half tempted to retreat to his cabin, to escape the suffocating air in the room. But he couldn't. They needed him to be present, to be steady, even if none of them said it. That was his job, his responsibility. He had been trained for this. But standing here, watching the crew quietly unravel in their own way, he couldn't help but feel that control was slipping from his grasp. He looked back at the engineer. The man was still working, tools moving with a kind of mechanical precision, but the commander could see the strain. There was no getting around it. The station was wearing on all of them. The engineer hadn't said much since the incident, but his silence spoke loudly. His hands worked, but his mind seemed elsewhere, locked in that moment when they all realized there was nothing more they could do. The commander turned away from the screens, feeling the weight on his shoulders. He had been trained for leadership, for these exact situations, but nothing in the training manuals prepared him for the gnawing uncertainty that had started to creep into his thoughts. He was meant to keep them on task, keep them focused on the mission. But in moments like this, with the air thick and heavy, with the station pressing in from all sides, it was hard to see the way forward. What now? He didn't have an answer. The engineer moved with his usual quiet precision, tools clinking softly as he knelt beside the engine control panel. The sound of the engines reverberated through the metal floor, steady and familiar, a rhythmic pulse that should have been comforting, but today it felt different, quieter, as though the station itself was holding its breath. He adjusted the alignment carefully, the cold glow from the panel casting sterile light over his hands. The engine room was cramped, a tangle of pipes and wires overhead, the ceiling low enough to make the walls seem closer than they were. Normally the engines were his sanctuary, the logical systems a relief from the strained tension between the crew. But now, everything felt increasingly wrong. A faint creak echoed coming from the vents, a subtle shift of metal on metal. The engineer froze, wrench poised mid-turn, his ears straining to locate the sound. He turned his head slowly, eyes scanning the shadows that stretched toward the far end of the room. Nothing. The faint murmur of the engines continued, unbothered by the disturbance. He swallowed hard and returned to his work, but the noise lingered in his thoughts. Probably just the station's usual groaning, the metal settling under pressure. He'd heard it 100 times before, but today it felt different, too deliberate. Another sound, soft, a shuffling barely audible over the background noise. His hand tightened on the wrench. He forced himself to keep working, but the tension settled in his shoulders, the growing sense of unease creeping in, cold and persistent. The air felt thicker here, almost suffocating. He wiped the sweat from his brow, a cold bead forming even though the temperature was regulated. His pulse quickened. It had to be nothing, just nerves. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were darker today, that they pressed in around him with sinister purpose. A faint clang echoed from near the vents again, sharper this time, like something shifting just out of sight. The engineer stood up slowly, his heart pounding, gaze fixed on the dark corners of the room. The engine thrummed steady as ever, but everything else felt still, almost too still. The sound could have been another crew member moving through the corridors, but why would they be near the vents? He swallowed, his throat dry, the tension thickening with every second. He wanted to call out, to break the oppressive silence, but something held him back. Some deep instinct told him to stay quiet. Another scrape of metal on metal, nearer now, just behind the vent's grate. Distracted, the wrench slipped from his hand, clattering onto the floor with a crash that shattered the quiet. His breath caught in his throat, eyes darting to the vent, waiting. Nothing. But the air felt charged now, the shadows almost alive, like they were watching him. He took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. The quiet felt wrong. The station was supposed to be empty, except for the crew, scattered across their workstations. But right now it didn't feel like it. It felt like something was there. Something was watching. His hand trembled as he reached for the wrench, his fingers brushing the cold metal, but his eyes never left the vent. The feeling crawled up his spine. A presence, unseen but undeniable, lurking in the dark. He stepped back toward the exit, his movements slow, deliberate. Every shadow felt heavier, the darkness closer, the station itself waiting for him to leave. He didn't even dare to turn his back. The terminal's steady rhythm filled the control room, a sound that usually grounded the Systems Analyst in his work. Today, though, it felt distant, like something happening far away. He sat at the console, hands resting on the keys, eyes locked on the scrolling data. The upload crawled along at a frustrating pace, and he tried to focus on the task, but his thoughts kept drifting. He clenched his jaw and entered a command, though his mind wasn't on the data. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop thinking about the disaster in the oxygen room. He hadn't been there at the time, but the news had rippled through the station like a dark tide. With a sharp exhale, the analyst shook off the thought. He had to focus, get the data uploaded, keep his systems running. There was no room for distraction here. His hands tapped out the next sequence, but the screen felt blurry, the numbers harder to follow than they should have been. The room around him was too quiet, the sound of the station's systems barely registering. Every now and then the soft blink of a status light caught his eye, but even that seemed muted, dimmer than usual. He rubbed his eyes, his breath shallow, trying to shake the growing sense of unease. This wasn't like him. He'd never been one to dwell. He was here to do a job, to keep the systems functioning, to maintain order. And yet the silence, which had once been routine, now felt thick, almost oppressive. His hand moved toward the comm panel, fingers brushing over the keys. He thought about sending a quick message to the others, checking in, establishing some kind of connection. But he didn't press the button. Instead, he stared at the screen, the data crawling by. They hadn't spoken much since the technician's death, and that silence seemed harder to break now. He turned his attention back to the upload. His hands moved mechanically, inputting the next set of instructions, but the movements felt hollow, like he was just going through the motions. Normally, he found comfort in the work, in the logic of it. But today it wasn't enough to keep the unease from creeping in. The space outside the small viewport caught his eye, pulling him away from the terminal for a moment. Beyond the thick glass, the void stretched out, black and endless, the distant stars flickering faintly. He stared at the darkness, feeling its weight press against the station, making the walls seem closer than they had before. He blinked, tearing his gaze away from the emptiness. He turned back to the console, fingers typing a little faster, as if the steady rhythm of the keys could drown out the discomfort. But the quiet wasn't just outside. It was inside the station, too, in the air they breathed, in the thin silence between every sound. A notification beeped on the console, signaling the transfer was complete. He leaned back in his chair, but there was no relief in the sound. The task was done, but the unease remained, heavy in the air. The death of a crewmate felt like a shadow in the room, lingering in the space between breaths. The analyst ran a hand through his hair, his gaze lingering on the screen, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The station wasn't supposed to feel like this. It had always been cold, sure, but reliable. Now it felt like something had shifted, something he couldn't quite explain. His fingers lingered over the comm panel again, but he didn't send the message. Instead, he sat in the quiet, trying to push the feeling away. But the silence only grew, and the station, once a place of routine, now felt like it was waiting for something to go wrong. The comms terminal in the cramped control station was dimly lit, bathed in the soft glow of the screens and the steady pulse of the data streams. The commander had told him to focus on finishing the upload, and he threw himself into the task, anything to keep his mind occupied. He tried not to think about it, but the unease was growing, threading itself through his thoughts like a shadow he couldn't shake. They had been told it was an accident, a suit breach, but alone in this room, something else gnawed at him. The station didn't feel right anymore. The data upload ticked slowly, 86% complete. He just needed to finish the task, wrap this up, and get back to the others. But in the quiet control room he was isolated, nothing but the soft click of keys and the muted hum of the equipment to keep him company. Out of the corner of his eye, a faint flicker caught his attention. One of the status lights on the far panel blinked for a fraction of a second, then returned to normal. The analyst hesitated, his hands hovering over the console. He turned his head slightly, squinting at the light, but everything appeared fine. Just a glitch, he thought, a minor fluctuation in the system, nothing to worry about. He'd seen worse. 87%. He refocused on the screen, fingers moving again, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. The quiet was too much now, heavy with the echo of something waiting to go wrong. His eyes drifted back to the blinking light, half expecting it to flicker again. When it didn't, he let out a breath, trying to convince himself it was nothing. 88%. The sound of the station had changed, subtle but there, like a vibration running beneath the usual mechanical hum. He frowned, his hands slowing over the keyboard as he strained to listen. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, a faint rumbling that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the walls. The back of his neck prickled. He told himself it was just his imagination, just the weight of the last few hours pressing on him. The station was old. No system was perfect. It was bound to make noises, especially after a repair as delicate as the oxygen system. 89%. A sharp beep broke the silence, piercing the air like a needle. The analyst flinched, his fingers freezing over the keyboard. He quickly scanned the terminal, heart racing. It wasn't a critical alert, just a temporary power fluctuation in one of the systems. He rubbed his palms together, trying to shake the tension from his hands. The station's power grid had always been finicky. The occasional dip in output was nothing unusual. He could fix it. 90%. The strange sound was growing louder now, a low rhythmic vibration that seemed to pulse through the floor beneath him. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing toward the source, but it was impossible to place. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, an unsteady thrum that grew harder to ignore. His stomach tightened. It wasn't just the hum of the station anymore. It felt like something was wrong. 91%. The low rumble persisted, more like a groan now, the kind of sound metal makes when it's under stress. The analyst tensed, gripping the edge of the console, his heartbeat quickening in time with the vibration. It could have been the repairs, maybe a system recalibration after the oxygen failure. That would explain the noises, but deep down, he wasn't so sure. 92%. Another sharp beep rang out, this time louder, the screen in front of him flickering for a split second before stabilizing. His pulse raced as he tapped furiously at the keys, trying to run a diagnostic. The power was still fluctuating, the system lagging behind the upload. He could feel his frustration building, sweat beading at his temples. Stay calm. It was just a minor issue. He could deal with it. 93%. But the sound beneath him was growing deeper, more insistent. It felt like the station itself was alive, stretching, groaning under the weight of something unseen. His fingers trembled as he typed the commands, trying to focus, trying to ignore the gnawing fear creeping up his spine. He had been in situations like this before, isolated, under pressure, but this felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that somehow the station was watching him. 94%. Another beep. The lights flickered above him, dimming for a moment before returning to their dull glow. He froze, eyes darting to the ceiling, then back to the console. The data stream had slowed, the upload lagging. He tapped at the keys again, trying to keep the anxiety at bay. He had to get through this. Just finish the upload. Don't think about the noise. Don't think about the technician. 95%. The flicker returned, this time longer, the lights cutting out for a full second before returning. His heart pounded in his chest, fingers fumbling over the keys as the station groaned louder, the sound reverberating through the walls like a distant warning. It's nothing, he told himself, but the lie felt weak, hollow. 96%. He ran a hand over his face, wiping the sweat from his brow, and leaned closer to the terminal. The upload was almost complete, just a few more minutes, and then he could leave the room. But the feeling of being watched, of something shifting within the station, wouldn't leave him. 97%. The room seemed darker now, the lights flickering more. His fingers hovered over the controls, reluctant to continue, but knowing he had no choice. The air felt colder, the sound of his own breathing too loud in the confined space. 98%. Another sharp beep, another flicker of the screen. The power drain was intensifying, the data feed slowing to a crawl. His chest tightened, the air feeling thick, suffocating. He needed to get out of this room, away from the groaning walls, away from the constant flicker of lights. 99%. He could barely focus, his hands shaking as they hovered over the final keystrokes. His mind raced, the sound of the station's groaning filling his head, drowning out everything else. He wanted to leave, but he couldn't. Not until the upload was complete. 100%. The screen blinked, data transfer complete, but the moment the upload finished, the lights overhead went out. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting the small apartment in a golden light. The hum of traffic outside was a constant, a familiar backdrop to the sounds of home. The analyst sat at the kitchen table, fingers idly tracing the rim of his coffee mug, a smile tugging at his lips. Across from him, his sister leaned back in her chair, watching him with an amused expression. "You still can't believe it, can you?" she teased, folding her arms across her chest. "Mr. Space Explorer." The systems analyst chuckled, shaking his head. "I guess not. It feels surreal, you know, like, how did I get so lucky?" "Because you worked your arse off, that's how," she replied, her voice warm with pride. "You earned this, Zahir. They don't send just anyone up there." He looked down, his smile widening. "I know, but still, the station, it's incredible. The tech, the systems, it's everything I've ever dreamed of working on. I can't wait to see it in person." She reached across the table, resting her hand on his. "You're going to be amazing. Just don't forget to send us pictures, okay? And maybe call every once in a while." "I will," he promised, squeezing her hand gently. "But you know it's going to be busy up there. Lots of data, constant monitoring." Her smile softened, a hint of concern creeping into her eyes. "Yeah, but don't get lost in it, Zahir. You've always been, well, a bit too into your work. Make sure you look after yourself too, okay?" He waved her off with a laugh. "I'll be fine. It's a mission, not a death sentence." The light flickered in the room as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the floor. The warmth of the kitchen felt comforting, grounding. He could smell the faint scent of spices from the dinner they'd shared, hear the soft murmur of life outside the window. It all felt so close, tangible. "You know, it's funny," he said after a moment, glancing toward the window. "I've always wanted to be out there, to see the stars from amongst them. But now that it's happening, it's hard to imagine leaving all this behind." His sister leaned forward, her gaze steady. "You're not leaving it behind, Zahir. You're taking it with you. Wherever you go, we'll still be here. And you'll always come back." He nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a warm blanket. "Yeah, you're right." For a brief moment they sat in comfortable silence, the sound of the city below filling the space between them. There was an easy familiarity to it, the kind that only family could bring, the kind that made him feel grounded no matter how far away he was about to go. "You're going to love it up there," his sister said finally, her voice soft but certain. "I know you will, And you're going to make us proud." He smiled, a quiet sense of contentment blooming in his chest. "Thanks. I can't wait to get started." The light shifted again, softer now, casting a golden hue over the room. In that moment, everything felt perfect. His future was bright, filled with the promise of adventure, of something bigger than himself. The station was going to be a new beginning, a place where he could finally make his mark. "I'll bring back stories," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "Lots of them." His sister laughed. "You better." They sat there together, their voices blending with the sounds of the city, the fading light wrapping them in the familiar embrace of home. It was a moment the analyst carried with him, a piece of earth, of family, tucked away in his heart as he prepared for the journey ahead. One moment the dim glow of the comm station bathed the room in a cold, sterile light. The next, the room plunged into absolute darkness, thick and oppressive. The Systems Analyst froze, hands still hovering over the terminal, his breath catching in his throat. For a second he thought the power might flicker back. Another brief fluctuation, nothing to worry about. But it didn't. Nothing happened. The station's hum was gone too, the faint vibration under his feet, the reassuring pulse of machinery. All of it had vanished, leaving only silence. It was the kind of silence that made his ears ring and his skin crawl. He couldn't see a thing. His fingers reached out instinctively, brushing against the console. The cool metal was familiar under his hands, grounding him in the void. But even the terminal was dead now. No light, no data, no hum of systems processing the steady stream of numbers. Just darkness. Panic clawed at the edge of his mind, sharp and insistent. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his breathing steady. The last thing he needed was to lose control. "Stay calm. This happens. It's a power failure. Just a power failure." The systems would reboot in a moment. The lights would flicker back to life, and he'd be able to see again. But the seconds stretched on and nothing changed. The air felt heavier now, pressing in around him like a living thing, and the silence seemed to pulse in his ears, louder than it had any right to be. His hand moved slowly, reaching for the emergency light fixed to the side of his workstation. His fingers brushed against empty air. The light was gone. A cold chill crept up his spine and his heart stuttered in his chest. He had seen it earlier. It had been right there. His hand fumbled against the console, patting the smooth surface where it should have been. Nothing. The analyst's breath quickened, each inhale sharp, too loud in the pressing dark. Where is it? His mind raced, heart pounding. His hands searched the station blindly, desperate for something to ground him. Then faintly, a sound. It wasn't the hum of the station coming back to life. It was something else, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A shuffle, like the sound of a footstep. Close. Too close. The analyst froze, every muscle in his body locking up. His pulse thudded painfully in his throat, each beat of his heart reverberating in the suffocating silence. The room was empty. He was alone. But the sound came again. This time it was clearer, a deliberate, measured movement not far from where he stood. Someone else was there. His breath caught in his throat, panic surging to the surface, hot and choking. He could feel his skin prickling, every nerve screaming for him to move, to run, to do something. But he couldn't. The darkness was too thick, too disorienting. He couldn't even tell which direction the sound was coming from. It seemed to circle him, pressing in closer with each heartbeat. Another shuffle. His hand snapped back to the console, gripping the edge so hard his knuckles ached. He forced himself to breathe, to think. There was no one here. It was his imagination, just his mind playing tricks in the dark. But the sound, it was real. He could hear it. His heart raced as he strained to listen, his ears hyper-attuned to every shift in the air. There it was again, a soft scrape, a whisper of movement. This time, closer, behind him. His blood ran cold. Slowly, painfully slowly, he turned his head, eyes wide and useless in the pitch black. His breath came in ragged bursts now, his lungs fighting for air that suddenly seemed too thick, too heavy. There was something behind him. Someone. He could feel it. The analyst zipped up his duffel bag, the last few personal items tucked neatly inside. The weight of the mission pressed against him, both literal and figurative. Every moment leading up to this had been calculated, anticipated, rehearsed. Yet now, standing on the edge of it all, it felt heavier. He glanced around the small room, bare, temporary, just a stopover before the long stretch ahead. His uniform hung crisply on the back of the chair, neatly pressed, as if the precision of the fabric could somehow ease the unease gnawing at the back of his mind. A message alert flashed softly on his comm device. Another notification, another reminder of the mission's importance. The analyst ignored it for a moment, letting the silence of the room settle. It was the last bit of quiet he'd have before the noise of the station took over, before the hum of machines and the constant tension of systems in need of maintenance would replace any chance for stillness. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his fingers tracing the sides of the comms unit. It was a sleek piece of tech, cutting edge, just like everything else about this mission, just like he'd always wanted. But beneath that pride, beneath the rush of ambition, was something quieter, a shadow of doubt, of loneliness that had lingered since he first signed up for the mission. His family had been proud, his friends too. They all had looked at him like he was heading for greatness, like he'd be the one to go beyond, to push past the ordinary and into the extraordinary. And wasn't that what he wanted? To be more than just another cog in the machine, more than just another technician running diagnostics on some earthbound system. He stood moving to the small mirror hanging above the desk. His reflection stared back at him, calm, steady, prepared. But in his own eyes he saw it again, that flicker of uncertainty, the weight of isolation, the understanding that out there, on that station, there wouldn't be anyone else to lean on. It would be him, the crew, and the vast emptiness of space, stretching out in every direction. He ran a hand over his hair, smoothing down the edges, trying to push the thought aside. He had trained for this. He was ready. This was everything he had worked for, the chance to prove himself, to show that he was more than capable of handling whatever challenges the station could throw at him. Loneliness was part of the job, just like everything else. He'd be too busy to feel it, too focused on the work. The isolation wouldn't touch him. Couldn't. His breath steadied as he reached for his uniform, pulling it on with the practiced motions of someone who had done it 100 times before. The maroon fabric was stiff against his skin, a reminder of the formality, the seriousness of what lay ahead. He had wanted this. He had chosen it. The doubts were fleeting. They had to be. He zipped up the uniform and fastened the cuffs, glancing at himself in the mirror one last time. The analyst stared back, ready, confident, ambitious. The quiet moments of self-reflection were over. It was time to focus, to push everything else aside and step into the role he had been training for. There was no room for hesitation now, only progress, only forward. He grabbed his duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder, the weight of it familiar, grounding. One last glance around the room, empty now. But that didn't matter. Soon he'd be somewhere else, somewhere bigger. The station was waiting. With a final breath, he stepped toward the door, leaving the small temporary room behind. The mission awaited him, and he wasn't going to let doubt slow him down. Not now. Not ever. "Hello?" His voice cracked, too quiet, swallowed up by the vast, suffocating dark. It barely sounded like his own. He waited, breath held tight in his chest, listening for anything to confirm what he knew, what he felt deep in his bones. His muscles tensed, his hands gripping the console so hard his fingers hurt. Silence pressed back against him. The analyst's breath came faster, not from a lack of oxygen, but from the mounting tension clawing at the edges of his mind. The darkness had swallowed him whole, thick and impenetrable, leaving him alone with the faint echo of his own heartbeat. He reached out in the void, fingers brushing across cold metal, but every surface felt distant, alien. A faint click sounded from somewhere behind him. His head jerked toward the noise, but the darkness offered no clues. His pulse quickened, the quiet of the room now amplifying every creak, every shift. He forced himself to move, muscles tightening as he pushed away from the console, his back pressed to the wall. The room felt even smaller now, claustrophobic, like it was closing in. Another sound, closer this time. A soft scrape like metal brushing metal. His hands trembled as he fumbled for his toolkit, desperate for something solid to ground himself. The tools rattled, too loud in the stillness. He forced himself to calm down, focus, breathe. There had to be an explanation. A blown fuse, a faulty circuit. Nothing more. But the darkness had its own weight, a presence. He could feel it, growing thicker, colder. His fingers brushed the handle of a screwdriver, gripping it tightly as if it could protect him from whatever was there. His breath came in shallow bursts, more out of panic than reason, but his mind was too tangled in fear to steady itself. Then a whisper of movement, right in front of him. His grip tightened on the tool, knuckles turning white. He swung blindly into the void, the metal striking only empty air, but it made him stumble forward. His foot caught on something, a cable, a tool left on the floor. He didn't know, but it sent him sprawling, crashing onto the hard surface with a sickening thud. Pain flared through his shoulder, but he barely registered it over the rising panic. He scrambled to his feet, heart pounding against his chest, pulse deafening in his ears. The screwdriver slipped from his hand, clattering uselessly to the floor, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. Another noise, soft but unmistakable, a low mechanical whine. It was the station, surely, but something about it felt off, wrong. The darkness pressed closer, suffocating in its silence. His hand shot out, reaching for the console, but his fingers met only empty space. He turned, frantic, but the room had changed, had shifted. Nothing was where it should have been. The cold metal walls that had felt so familiar now seemed distant, unreachable, like he was floating, untethered, in the void. The sound came again, this time from the side, closer still. He stumbled backward, breath hitching in his throat. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, someone, was there, watching him, moving with him in the dark. But there were no footsteps, no clear sign of movement, just the weight of something unseen creeping through the silence. His back hit the wall hard. The impact rattled through him, leaving him disoriented, gasping for air that felt too thick. His hands splayed out against the cold surface, searching for anything familiar, anything to anchor him. But the cold felt deeper now, biting into his skin, seeping through his uniform. And then, a sharp pain. It was quick, like a sudden needle piercing his side. He gasped, his hand instinctively moving to the spot, fingers pressing against the fabric. Wet, warm. He pulled his hand back, even though he couldn't see it, knowing the truth before it registered in his mind. It was blood. His breath caught in his throat, panic flooding every nerve. He tried to move, to call out, but his voice was gone, trapped in his chest. His vision swam, the darkness twisting around him, warping into something darker and far more sinister. The pain spread, sharp and cold, radiating through his side up into his chest. He stumbled again, legs buckling beneath him. He reached out, fingers clawing at the floor, but the cold metal offered no support, no comfort. He could feel his strength fading, slipping away as the darkness pressed in from all sides. He collapsed to the floor, his body limp, the soft sound of his fall lost in the vast emptiness around him. The pain dulled, fading into numbness as he felt his breaths grow shallower, more labored. His mind raced, desperate for a way out. But there was nothing, no light, no sound, just the weight of the cold and the final agonizing realization. He was alone, completely and utterly alone. The analyst's final breath was soft, barely more than a sigh in the inky darkness. The station remained quiet, indifferent, the rest of the crew oblivious.